The storm came the night they sold her. Not with lightning, not with thunder. It came the way all terrible things come, quietly, dressed in the language of necessity. Wearing the face of a father who had run out of options, Seraphina Calloway stood at the window of her childhood bedroom and watched the rain drag itself down the glass like something grieving. She was 22 years old, and she had never been kissed. She had never danced at a bonfire, never stayed out past midnight, never done any of the reckless, luminous things that other girls her age spoke about like they were currencies she simply didn't carry. Her father had kept her close. She understood now why. Sierra, her younger sister Mia, appeared in the doorway, 11 years old, barefoot, her nightgown twisted at the hem. "Are the men downstairs going to take you away?" Seraphina turned from the window and smiled. It was the smile she had been practicing her whole life, the one that said everything is fine. The one she wore like armor over all the things that were not fine at all. "Come here," she said. Mia crossed the room and Seraphina pulled her close, pressing her lips to the top of her sister's head. She smelled like lavender soap and childhood, that specific, fleeting scent that Seraphina knew even now she would spend the rest of her life trying to find again. "I'm going somewhere for a little while," Seraphina said carefully, "but you're going to be okay. Dad's debt is going to be cleared, and you're going to finish school. And you're going to become the veterinarian you always said you'd be. But what about you?" Seraphina didn't answer that. She held her sister tighter instead. Downstairs, in the study that smelled of old wood and older failures, her father Thomas Calloway sat across from three men who were not entirely men. She could tell from the top of the staircase. It was something in the way they sat, too still, too certain, carrying the specific gravity of creatures who had never once in their lives been the weakest thing in a room. The one in the center wore a charcoal suit. His hair was dark and cut close. He hadn't looked up since she'd appeared on the stairs, but she had the uncanny sensation that he had known she was there before she'd taken the first step. "Seraphina," her father's voice was hoarse. He couldn't meet her eyes. "Come down, please." She descended. The man in the charcoal suit looked up, and the world, very briefly, rearranged itself. He was beautiful the way storms are beautiful, the kind of beauty that your instincts correctly identify as dangerous. His eyes were the pale gray of winter sky just before it breaks open. And they moved over her with an expression she couldn't read. Not hunger, not cruelty, something more complex and more unsettling than either assessment. "This is Damien Voss," her father said. "Alpha of the Ironveil Pack. He's agreed to forgive the debt." Seraphina had heard the name. Everyone in Millhaven had heard the name, the same way everyone knows the name of a fault line running beneath the town they live in, not because they think about it every day, but because somewhere in the back of the mind, the knowledge sits, waiting. Damien Voss, 31 years old. He had taken control of the Ironveil Pack at 24 after his father's death, and in 7 years had expanded their territory, brokered an unprecedented peace with the Eastern Packs, and built a legitimate business empire that gave the wolves something rare and precious: anonymity. The humans of Millhaven knew there was old money behind the Voss name. They did not know what old money meant among the Packs. In exchange for what? Seraphina asked. She directed the question at Damien Voss rather than her father, because she had learned long ago that the person who holds the debt holds the truth. Something shifted in his expression, a fractional surprise, quickly smoothed away. "One night," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "A binding ceremony, witnessed by my beta and my elder. It grants my pack legal continuity under the old law. A mated alpha cannot be challenged for succession until the bond is formally dissolved." He paused. "You would be compensated. Your family's debt cleared. You would leave the following morning and the dissolution would be filed within the month. You'd be free." Seraphina stared at him. "You need a fake wife," His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A temporary ceremonial mate, because someone in your pack is challenging your leadership. The pause that followed was a fraction longer than it should have been. The binding ceremony closes that window, and you chose my father's debt as leverage because your father approached me, Damien said quietly. He offered. I accepted the terms he named. I did not coerce him. Seraphina looked at her father then. Thomas Calloway had the decency to look at the floor. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Let herself feel, in those 3 seconds, everything she was not going to let herself feel afterward. The hurt, the fury, the grief of being bargained away by the person who was supposed to protect her. She let it move through her like a wave and then she let it go. She opened her eyes. Fine, she said. One night. Act 2. The Ironveil grounds. They drove for 40 minutes outside of town, into the territory that the Ironveil Pack had held for generations, forested, elevated, hidden behind a glamour of remoteness that discouraged casual visitors. The estate emerged from the trees like something dreamed, stone and timber and warm amber light bleeding through tall windows, surrounded by the kind of quiet that only exists far from human roads. Seraphina sat in the back of the car with Damien Voss and watched the trees pass and said nothing. He also said nothing. They were, she would later think, equally well practiced at silence. A woman met them at the entrance, late 40s, silver-streaked hair, posture like a person who had never once in her life second-guessed herself. She gave Seraphina a long, measuring look and then turned to Damien with an expression that contained multitudes. The elder is ready, she said. Marcus is already pushing back on the ceremony timeline. Marcus can push all he likes, Damien said, with a calm that sounded almost bored. Is the room prepared? Yes. Then we'll proceed. The woman, his beta Seraphina would learn, her name was Cora, led them through hallways lined with pack history, paintings, photographs, carved wooden plaques bearing names and dates. Seraphina walked with her spine straight and her hands still at her sides, cataloging everything with the focused practicality she applied to anything she was frightened of. She acknowledged privately, quite frightened. Not of him precisely. Of the ceremony. Of the old law he'd mentioned, which she didn't fully understand but which carried the weight of something primal and binding in ways that the word temporary might not be able to fully contain. A small room off the main hall had been prepared, candles. An elder, ancient, silver-eyed, emanating the specific energy of someone who had watched centuries accumulate. 2 witnesses. And the ceremony itself. The elder spoke quietly to Damien in the old language for a moment, and then she also was gone. And the room held only the 2 of them, and the candles burning down and the silence of the Ironveil ground. Dees pressing softly against the windows. There's a room prepared for you, Damien said. His voice was slightly different. Rougher at the edges like something had worn at it. Is that where the night happens? Seraphina asked. She had promised herself she would be direct. She found directness was the only way she survived things. He turned to look at her. What do you mean? You said one night, a binding ceremony. I don't. She stopped, reorganized. I want to know what the terms actually mean. The elder spoke about something I didn't understand. She said the binding needed to be consummated. Damien said. The word dropped into the silence. Between them, under the old law, he continued, his voice careful, controlled, the voice of someone choosing each word with surgical precision. A ceremonial mating is only fully recognized if it is consummated before the night ends. Otherwise it can be contested. He looked at the far wall. Marcus's people would contest it immediately. They've likely already anticipated the ceremony. The consummation is what makes it unassailable. Seraphina stood very still. You didn't tell me that part, she said quietly. No. A pause. I didn't. Why? He looked at her then, and she saw in his face something she had not expected to find there, something that looked like discomfort, like shame, because I knew if I did. Your father would have had to find another solution, and his debt was significant, Seraphina said. Yes, she breathed, in the logical part of her mind, the part that had always been the loudest part, the part that had kept her functional through every impossible thing her life had handed her. She inventoried the situation. The debt was real. Her sister's future was real. The binding had been spoken. The old law was not a human law. It did not have loopholes she could navigate in a courthouse. And this man, this alpha who had said the word consummated and then looked at the wall, was waiting. I want something in exchange, she said. He looked at her. Not money. My father negotiated the money. She kept her eyes level on his. I want your word. Your pack alpha word, or whatever it is that actually binds you. That this is one night. That the dissolution happens exactly as you described. That you never involve my family in pack business again. Something moved across his face. It wasn't the assessment from before. It was something quieter and more complex. You have it, he said. Say it properly. A beat of silence. And then, on my blood and my name and the Ironveil line, I give you my word. One night. Clean dissolution. Your family is beyond my reach from this night forward. He paused. Does that satisfy you? Seraphina nodded. One more thing, she said. Name it. B. She stopped, started again, and it cost her something to say it, cost her more than she wanted it to. Be gentle. Act 3. One night he was. That was what she hadn't expected, what no version of this night she'd mapped out in her mind had accounted for. The gentleness of him. The careful, deliberate way he moved, as though he was aware of something fragile in the room that he was determined not to break. He asked her, once, halfway through the process of the world reordering itself around her, if she was all right. She said yes. She was not certain she'd answered in her own voice. He had touched her like she was something worth touching carefully, and that had been, in its way, harder to bear than coldness would have been. Coldness she could have held herself separate from. This slow, burning attention, she had no defense for. She didn't tell him. She almost told him once, when his hand stilled in the dark and he looked at her with those winter sky eyes and asked, again, are you all right? And she understood that he was asking something more specific now. Asking a question with another question inside it, but she said yes. And it was true, she was all right. She was in the soft amberlit dark of the Ironveil estate, surrounded by the warmth of an alpha who had promised her gentleness and kept his promise, more than all right in ways she was not equipped to examine. She didn't tell him she was a virgin. She would not know, until much later, that he had figured it out anyway. Afterward, he slept. Seraphina lay in the darkness beside him and stared at the ceiling and listened to his breathing slow and steady beside her. And she made a private inventory of all the things she was not going to feel. She was practical. She had always been practical. One night he had said, clean dissolution within the month. She would go home to Mia and her father's debt would be cleared and she would find a job in the city. Something far from Millhaven, something that let her build a life from clean materials. She would be fine. She was fine. She was absolutely, completely fine, lying in the dark beside an alpha werewolf who smelled like cedar and winter rain, feeling for the first and possibly last time in her life, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She rose before dawn. She dressed quietly in the dark. She found her bag where Cora had left it by the door. She took one look back at the bed, at the broad line of his shoulders in the gray pre-dawn, at the dark hair against the pillow, at the hand that had been holding hers just hours ago now lying open and relaxed against the sheets, and she walked out. Act 4. The thing that wouldn't dissolve the dissolution papers came 3 weeks later. Seraphina signed them at the kitchen table of the apartment she'd rented in the city, using a pen that ran out of ink halfway through and required her to press hard to finish the signature. She set the papers aside and made coffee and stood at her own window, in her own apartment, looking at her own small city view, and she thought about nothing in particular. She was fine. She was not fine. She was for weeks pregnant. She found out on a Tuesday, with a test from the pharmacy on the corner, in the bathroom of her new apartment with the door locked even though she lived alone. She stared at the result for so long that she lost track of time. And when she came back to herself, she was sitting on the edge of the bathtub with the test in her hands, and the coffee she'd made had one entirely cold. She was not supposed to be able to get pregnant this easily. Doctors had suggested, after an examination in her early 20s following irregular cycles, that she might have difficulty conceiving. The word difficult had been used. Apparently, the universe found the word difficult flexible. She sat with it for a long time. Then she did what she had always done with things that were enormous and terrifying and required her to keep functioning anyway. She made a list. Practical steps. Immediate needs. The shape of a life that could be built around this, that could hold this. She did not call Damien Voss. The dissolution papers were signed. His word had been given. His Pack Alpha promise spoken formally. Her family was beyond his reach. She was technically no longer anything to him. She told herself this was a decision she was making freely. She told herself this right up until 5 months later, when she was visibly, unmistakably pregnant, and the question of what she was actually doing pressed itself against her like weather. Act 5, he finds out she had not accounted for Cora. She had forgotten, or perhaps chosen not to think too carefully about, the fact that werewolves have networks that operate outside human logic. That Cora, who had measured her in the doorway with those sharp dark eyes, was someone who remained loyal to her alpha in ways that ran deeper than employment. Cora found her at the farmer's market on a Saturday morning in November, 7 months along, wearing a coat that no longer fully buttoned across the front. Seraphina Calloway, said Cora, appearing at her elbow with the same uncanny certainty she'd had in the Ironveil hallway, and Seraphina's entire nervous system made a sound like a struck bell. She turned. Cora looked at her stomach. Seraphina watched Cora's expression perform a series of rapid, complex calculations. "Oh," said Cora quietly. "Oh, you foolish, stubborn girl." "Please don't," Seraphina said. "He doesn't know. He doesn't need to know." "Seraphina." Cora's voice dropped. "A Pack Alpha's heir is my child," Seraphina said, and her voice came out level and cool and entirely unlike the interior of her, which was rioting. "I signed the dissolution. The ceremony is over. His word was that my family is beyond his reach. This is separate. You know it isn't. I'm making it separate." Cora looked at her for a long time with an expression that reminded Seraphina of her own mother, who had died when she was 13. That specific combination of exasperation and worry and a tenderness that doesn't know what to do with itself. "He's going to find out," Cora said finally. "Whether from me or from the bond itself eventually, Seraphina, you were bound under the old law. Even dissolved on paper, there are ties. He's going to feel something, and when he investigates, then that's when it becomes a problem," Seraphina said. "Right now, today, I am going home and I am going to make soup and I am not going to think about this." Cora opened her mouth. "Please," Seraphina said quietly. "Just that. Just the one word." Cora closed her mouth. She left. And Seraphina stood at the farmer's market with a bag of winter vegetables and one hand pressed flat against the side of her stomach where her daughter, she knew it was a girl, Knew it the way she knew things sometimes without being able to explain the knowing, had just kicked, hard and deliberate, as if she too had something to say about all of this. I know, Seraphina said quietly to her stomach, I know. He came on a Wednesday. She opened the door and there he was, Damien Voss, in a grey jacket this time, no charcoal suit. Looking like something that had walked out of the in-between spaces of her sleep for the past 7 months. His eyes went immediately to her stomach and stayed there, and she watched his face go through something she had never seen on it before. Something cracked open and then went very, very still. You should have told me, he said. Come in, she said, because the alternative was having this conversation in the hallway, and her neighbor Mrs. Adime was an enthusiastic eavesdropper. He came in. He stood in her small apartment among her practical furniture and her books stacked sideways because she'd run out of shelf space. And he was too large for it. Not physically, exactly, but in the way that certain presences are too large for ordinary rooms. You should have told me, he said again. You should have disclosed the full terms of the ceremony before I agreed to it, she said pleasantly. We both have notes. Something in his jaw shifted. That's not Seraphina, this is my child. Yes, she said, and also mine, and I am capable and employed and healthy and I have thought very carefully about this and I do not need. I'm not talking about what you need, he said, and there was something fraying at the edges of his control now, something breaking through the careful, unhurried exterior. I'm talking about he stopped. Pressed a hand across his mouth briefly, a gesture so human and unguarded that it startled her. I've been feeling something for months. Edge. Like something was wrong but I couldn't locate it. My elder said the dissolved bond sometimes leaves echoes but He looked at her, and his eyes were the same winter sky, and he was furious and she realized, genuinely hurt him. I didn't know, and I should have been able to. You couldn't have known, she said, more gently than she'd intended. I made sure why. The question filled the room. Seraphina stood in her apartment, 7 months pregnant, looking at the alpha who had kept his word in every way that mattered and who was looking at her now like she'd taken something from him. Because it was supposed to be one night, she said. That was the agreement. People are allowed to change agreements. You were very clear about what you wanted. I was clear about what the pack needed, he said. I was not clear, I didn't, Seraphina. He stopped again. And then he said, in a different voice entirely, a voice that had the old roughness in it that she remembered from the edges of a night 7 months ago. You walked out before I woke up. She said nothing. I noticed, he said. I noticed that you were gone. I noticed that the room was empty and that there was. He looked at the window. I noticed. The apartment was very quiet. I didn't know what to do with that, Seraphina admitted. It cost her. She felt it go. I didn't know what to do with any of it. And it was supposed to be one night, and I had a plan and the plan didn't. She stopped. She keeps kicking, she said inanely, irrelevantly. Damien Voss looked at her stomach. He said. I think so. I mean, I don't know, I haven't. I told the doctor I didn't want to know but he said. I know, she agreed. He crossed the room, and she did not step back. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, that specific, particular warmth that she had tried very hard not to think about for 7 months, and he looked at her face first, one long careful look, before his eyes dropped to her stomach. He stopped. She took his hand. She wasn't sure why she did it. Later, she would tell herself it was practical, it was easier than explaining. She took his hand and placed it flat against her stomach, in the place where her daughter had been kicking all morning. The baby, as if she had been waiting, kicked hard. Unmistakable. Damien Voss made a sound, barely a sound, a breath, something that didn't have a name. and his hands spread wide against her stomach, and he didn't say anything for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were different. "I want to be here," he said quietly. "I understand if you need time. I understand if the terms were wrong, and I should have been honest with you from the start. And I should have. I know I should have, but I want to be here for her, and," he stopped, "and for you, if you'll let me." Seraphina looked at him. She looked at this alpha who had kept every word of his promise, who had been gentle when she'd asked him to be gentle, who had signed the dissolution without protest and had apparently spent 7 months feeling the echo of something he couldn't name, who was standing in her small apartment holding his hand against their daughter's kick like he was holding something sacred. She was practical. She had always been practical. But she was finally willing to admit, completely and entirely undone. "I need coffee," she said. Double quotes decaf. Because. She gestured at her stomach. "Sit down." He sat. She made coffee. And outside the window of her small apartment, the city moved through its ordinary Wednesday, entirely unaware that in one upstairs kitchen, a woman who had spent her whole life being practical was letting herself, for the first time, want something that she hadn't planned for. Epilogue. What the night left behind. She named her Ren Voss Calloway, born on a snowy March morning, with dark hair and gray eyes that were, unmistakably, her father's. Damien was in the room. He had asked carefully, 3 months before, if he could be, and Seraphina had said yes because she was learning, slowly, imperfectly, in the way of someone who had spent 22 years being practical and self-contained, to say yes to the things she actually wanted. He held Ren first, while Seraphina was being seen to, and she watched from across the room as this alpha, this man who had authority over hundreds of wolves, who had built an empire and brokered peace treaties and carried the weight of a pack on his shoulders, held a 7-pound infant with the specific terror and reverence of someone encountering something entirely outside his experience. He looked up and found Seraphina watching. He stopped. "I know," Seraphina said. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the narrow hospital bed, and she leaned against him because she was exhausted and because he was warm and because she was done, finally, pretending that she wanted to be anywhere other than exactly here. "The night," he said, his voice low above her head. "What about it?" "I knew that night." A pause. "That you were." "I know," Seraphina said. "I figured that out." "The way you..." She stopped. "You were careful, yes. You didn't say anything." "Neither did you." His arm tightened slightly around her. "I thought you had your reasons." "I did," she said. "They were bad reasons." She felt his chest move. The first time she'd heard him laugh. "They weren't entirely bad," he said. Between them, Ren made a small, disgruntled sound, as if she had an opinion about the characterization of her own origins, which she wanted the room to know about. They both looked down at her. "Hi," Seraphina said very softly. Ren opened her gray eyes. The night had been one night. But the things it left behind, the stubborn, living, breathing, gray-eyed things, refused entirely to be temporary.